All right, so this is really kind of for us in our own kind of personal lives, well-being of our souls. We're involved in ministry. How do we navigate that? And I want to talk about this topic. How do we thrive when we're involved in a life of doing ministry around two different verses in the Bible and really around two different words. And the first verse is in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 58, where Paul says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." And the key word there is the word abound. That's what I want to focus on. It's a very rich word. It's one of the most distinctively Pauline words. The little Greek word is parasio, which means to overflow. Picture I always have in my mind about this one, our son Johnny, when he was a little guy, maybe 5 years old, he desperately wanted to pour his own glass of milk. And Nance was very reticent, but he said he'd be really careful, and so she said, okay. And so this little guy put that glass up on the table, and then he took the carton and just, dumped it over, and the milk came gushing out, and then he pulled it back and went it right up to the very top of the lid and actually crowned the glass. And he was so thrilled, and then he just lifted it up in triumph, and it spilled all over the place. But for that one moment, it's like it just overflowed. It was like every bit of that glass was filled. It could not hold anymore. And that's a Jesus word. He would say, I have come that you might have life and have it overflowing. Dallas used to say, and have it come running out your ears. Because it's like there's so much of it in you that you can't hold it in anymore. That's what it means to overflow. Paul says, God, grace overflows to us in Christ. God overflows in mercy. And the idea is, I want you to overflow, abound in the work of the Lord. Now, what would that look like? Well, it's things like, I want you to take your spiritual giftedness. Everybody, if the Holy Spirit's in you, on you, then you have been gifted by God to do work, and I want you to develop that to the absolute fullest potential that you're able to do. If it's shepherding or administrating or encouraging or whatever it is, leading, just hone it, develop it. I want you to discover the deepest passions that God kind of hardwired into you. I want you to fan them into flame. I want you to have some fire in your belly. I want you to be fully alive around this. I want you to experience such a deep level of motivation. If you're working in a church, that sometimes when you think about the work of the Lord, it keeps you awake at night dreaming about how you can abound in it even more. Work in the Lord and to abound in it so much that you sometimes think to yourself, I would do this for nothing. I want you to develop your character such that on those days when the circumstances are hard, and we all face that, or emotions are troublesome, or when you feel like coasting or quitting or avoiding or procrastinating or letting your attitude go down or kind of giving up, that instead you develop this internal fortitude that you're going to put your hand to the plow and not look back and not give up, and even in those moments work wholeheartedly as unto the Lord. I want you to have a great work ethic, a great attitude. And of course, that all sounds great now, but when the moment comes to actually do it, that's the test. And nobody can do that for us. And it flows out of this picture that I'm living in the kingdom of God. Paul's language is so interesting. Abound in the work of the Lord because you know your labor in the Lord. We're doing the work of the Lord, the work that God wants done on this world, extending His kingdom, His dominion. But we're not just doing the work of the Lord, we're laboring in the Lord. We're doing it together with God. And Paul himself did this. He says, at one point, for I am being poured out like a drink offering. And that is not a picture of casual, comfortable labor offered when my personal world makes it easy. I fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness. And I want to be able to say when I get to the end of my life, God, I abounded in your work. I didn't do it perfectly. It might not always look impressive. But the best I could with your help, I really abounded in the work of the Lord. And everybody here wants that. And Jesus asked that of us. It's always abounding in the work of the Lord. That's one word, that word abound, that verse. Be steadfast, immovable, always abound. And then the other verse comes from John 15, verse 4, where Jesus says, "Abide in me, and I will abide in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must abide. Neither can you bear fruit by yourself. You must abide." That's the second word, abide. We're told to abound in the work of the Lord, but also to abide in the presence of the Lord. And this, too, is a real important word in the New Testament. It's a little Greek word, meno, which meant to dwell in something, to live in something. In our day, we would talk about having deep roots or being centered. We would use that kind of language to describe this. The idea here is be a woman, be a man of deep prayer, be fully authentic. Don't hydroplane over your emotional life. Experience joy deeply, experience sorrow deeply. Live in the way that Jesus would live if he was in my place. Refuse to go through a life with a driven, frenzied attitude, living at a pace of a world that's just gone mad. Have the Lord for my shepherd. Allow God to make me lie down in green pastures and lead me beside still waters and restore my soul. And Jesus says things like, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle." This is Jesus saying this. "I am gentle and humble in heart." And again, this language, "and you will find rest for your souls." Now, soul rest is very, very deep. It includes having a rested body, but it includes all of our parts, having a refreshed mind, and having a will that is not depleted. Jesus says, "For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." He is the Lord of the easy yoke and the light burden. So, here's a question I want to ask, and I'll do kind of a show of hands on this one. On the one hand, we're called in the Bible to abound. Run the race, fight the fight, go into all the world, open your eyes, it's ripe to harvest, seize the opportunity, redeem the time, the days are evil, always be abounding in the work of the Lord. On the other hand, we're called to abide. Learn to live as God's beloved, have the Lord as your shepherd, grow in the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, be still, and know that I am God. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. Now, here's the question I have for us today. How many people here ever feel any tension between abounding and abiding? Raise your hands. Anybody here? I think this is a huge deal for those of us that are involved in ministry. And I'll tell you one person who feels this tension really strongly. I do. I feel very committed to abounding. I want to do the best that I can at the work that I think God gives me. I want to be the best communicator, teacher, speaker, writer that I can be. I want to champion that value for churches. I want the church that I serve, Menlo Park Presbyterian Church, to just flourish. I just ache for it to be a place where if somebody comes on staff, they feel like this is a great place to work. If they serve on staff where they say, I have a great boss, where all throughout the organization there's that sense that people are serving in the right area and they're being developed and they're getting honest feedback and we're building the right kind of culture. I want to live spiritual formation in my church and in my own life and around the world and kind of contribute that to a movement. And this is real personal for me. I'll get feedback from our elders sometimes on how I'm doing, what my work is like. I do that at least once a year in a real formal way, and more often than that, informally. I actually never want the elders to push me harder on how I'm doing than I have pushed myself. I want my standards between me and God for what I'm doing to be higher than anybody else's standard for me. Not in the neurotic sense, not in a perfectionistic way or a self-absorbed way, but this is my one chance to do what I was put on the planet to do. This is my race, and I will not have another one. It's not my elders' race. They've got their own. It's not my wife. She's got hers, not our staff's. I want good feedback. I want to be open. I don't want anybody to take my race for God, my work for God more seriously than I do. I want to love that. Like when Paul says that, always abounding in the work of the Lord, I think we're to take that really seriously. And then there's always the pressures that we have in every season of life. I remember when I was in Chicago, Nance came on staff and she started working full-time in ministry with ministry to young people, which meant that she was constantly interacting with young guys in their 20s, which meant I had to remain in superb physical condition. And then we have children, and they're in their 20s right now. And I had this kind of naive idea when I first had kids that once they hit 18, I'd be done. And like I found out it's very different from that. I'm really glad, but that's very different. And lots of possibilities and lots of opportunities. And I'll just wrestle. Am I getting all the pieces of it right? And when I think about my parents, and am I spending the time with them that I want to, and my children, and my wife, and my friends. The farther I go along in life, sometimes it seems like there's opportunities that expands, but then time is super finite. And part of my job, and this is true for most of us in here, is a lot of what we do involves talking a lot about God. Talking a lot about prayer or faith or spiritual disciplines. That can be kind of dangerous. Do I really believe at the level of my mental map what it is that I'm talking about? And how dangerous is it when there's kind of a space between what I'm talking about and what I'm actually believing or feeling on the inside, the condition of my heart? And I'll wrestle with this. And I learned about this early on back when I was at Fuller and I was going through grad school, and I started working at this church at La Crescenta, and I started doing therapy, and I found out I was a really bad therapist. I won't tell you that story, but I began sitting with people in a little room and talking with them about their problems, and I realized if I had to do this the rest of my life, I would slit my wrists. And that's not a good attitude to have if you're, wanting to help somebody. And I believe deeply in therapy, and I need it, and I receive it, and it's a holy space, but it's like that's not what God wired me up for. And then I started to work at a church, and I started to preach, and I thought, oh, God, I love doing this. And then I had this weird thing where I got up one Sunday to preach at First Baptist La Crescenta, and I was about 5 or 10 minutes into the message that I was going to give, and all of a sudden, the room started to kind of spin around a little bit, and I got kind of dizzy and felt kind of weird, and the next thing I knew, I had fainted dead away on the platform. And that was a bad experience, especially because it was not a charismatic church where you get credit for that kind of thing. It was a Baptist church where, nobody's impressed by that. And it was right before I was going to get married, and there was finals going on, and we were going to go away for a year to study overseas, and I thought, well, there's lots going on, that's what's behind it, and so I went away for a year, came back, returned to Fuller, kept working at that church, and the very next time I got up to preach, the same thing happened. Fainted dead away. And by this time, I knew that I loved to preach and felt called to it, but you can't preach if you faint on a regular basis. Makes people kind of nervous, and I remember going to Arch Hart, who was the head of the psych school then, to just try to begin to learn what was going on and what were the vulnerable areas inside of me, and having to deal with stress, and then having all kinds of people from the church come up and say, just trust God when you preach. Oh, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. And, people see the weakness inside me. I don't want people to see weakness inside. I don't like that. I don't like that word, weak. And, I think for all of us, there's like one word that we least want to hear about ourselves. And for me, it's that word, weak. I hate that word. And to realize that that's in me, and to open myself to God up to it, and to continue to make the difficult choices that can move me towards living in the strength of the Lord in the way that God calls me to. And one of the statements in the Bible that came very alive to me in that process is Paul struggling with the thorn in his flesh. Remember that story? And for me, that was like, that's the thorn in my flesh. And Paul says, 3 times I asked God to take it away. And finally God said, no, I will not take it away. But I will tell you that my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. And so I had to learn in a real concrete way, like, I had this thing that I loved and I felt called to do, and I didn't know if I'd be able to keep doing it. I could not even get myself to be standing at the end of a message. It's part of why I'm sitting right now. In this talk, what I want to do is just give some observations about how can we abound and abide. And you all can see what might be helpful to you, but we'll just talk about how do we abide and abound. And the first observation I'll put in the form of a question: when can I expect this tension between abounding and abiding to go away? Anybody want to guess? When you die. When you die, things will settle way down in your life. But when I was in middle school, we used to have a saying, death is nature's way of telling you to slow down. And there's some truth to that. But probably as long as you're alive, this one will never go away. And what's kind of interesting is Jesus wrestled with this tension throughout his ministry. So in Mark 1, you see after the baptism, the Spirit sent him out into the desert, and he was in the desert 40 days. And he's abiding with God. And then right after that, in verse 14, Jesus goes into Galilee and proclaims the good news of God, and he begins to abound in the work of the Lord. And then in verse 35, it says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed, and he was going to abide with his Father. But in the very next verse, Simon came looking for him, and they said, everybody's looking for you. You're completely out of contact. Your cell phone's turned off. We can't get in touch with you. And Jesus doesn't say, don't bother me now. This is my abiding time. He says, okay, we'll abound. And all through Jesus' life, you see this rhythm and this tension, because he really became a human being. And the scriptures are full of these quite remarkable statements about the humanity of Jesus. He got thirsty. He got tired. He got hurt. He bled. He cried. He really was fully human. And so he knew he had to wrestle with finitude and humanity and limits. And we learn from him how to go about this. There are churches where nobody really cares, on the one hand, about results, where they really don't care about abounding in God's work. And sometimes people can work there 20 or 30 or 40 years and there's no fruit and they don't abound and nobody confronts. I don't want to live like that. They're never really honest about, are we actually, being effective? Not in superficial ways, but like truthfully. Are people serving in areas where they're gifted to serve? And I don't want to live like that. On the other hand, there are churches and ministries where people run around in a frenzy of activity and exhaustion and burnout, and they may pile up impressive-looking lists of accomplishments, but they are superficial about their spiritual life. They use people, they manipulate people, they live with preoccupied souls. There's no depth. The truth is they're running around on ego and ambition covered by a thin veneer of spiritual-sounding language. And I don't want to live like that. So I fully expect to wrestle with this tension until I die. And here's part of what happens. I adjust my life for one season, and that rhythm may kind of get under control, and then things change. Things change at work, or things change at home, or things change in my own spiritual life or my physical life, and I have to change again. It's never over. So when will this tension be over? It'll never be over. As long as you're alive, the tension between abounding and abiding will continue on. And it's real good to name that. Not be surprised by it. Not think that you're doing something wrong if you're wrestling with it. Jesus did. Everybody does. Second observation, I'll also put in the form of a question. Who is responsible for my getting this right? And the correct answer would be, I am. It is human nature to evade responsibility and think somebody else ought to be in charge of this. another table moment with Johnny. He used to get in trouble for spilling sometimes, and he had done it several times and was just in kind of a squirrely mood, and he was headed for serious consequences. I warned him if he did not settle down at the table, the consequences would involve the loss of Mr. Nintendo, which back then that was a big deal. And sure enough, a few minutes later, there was another spill of Exxon Valdez proportions. And I said to him, all right, Johnny, you know the consequences. This is a true story. He pulled $1 out of his pocket, handed it to me, and said, maybe Mr. Washington can change your mind. Like, where do kids get this stuff? Jesus tells the story about the parable of the talents, that's where we get the word talent from, that our God is the Lord of the talents, and he gives them to us. And then eventually one day he comes to settle accounts. There is one before whom we will all stand, and he's loving and holy and gracious and just, but he intends for us to understand we really will give account to him for our lives. And we will not be able to finesse our way around that throne. Mr. Washington will not change his mind. One of the most amazing statements in the last year of Dallas's life that he made, we were talking to him, and he was quite sick at this point, and very interesting conversations. And somebody asked him, as you look back on your life from this vantage point, are there things that you regret? And I'll never, ever forget this. He said, I regret having wasted so much time. And we all, or at least I thought, are you kidding me? Oh God, what hope is there for the rest of us if Dallas has been a slacker? Because it seems like all the time he's learning and reading and studying, or he's writing, or he's teaching, or he's helping people, or he's doing carpentry and so. And it was a really interesting conversation. Some people tried to actually kind of change his mind. No, you don't really mean that. But I think, because I thought about it a little bit of it might be kind of like this. My real good friend, I'm going to leave here as soon as this session's done, and then Gary Franklin's going to go take me to be with my friend Chuck. When we were in our mid-30s, I was living in Southern California. Chuck was here in Atlanta. Chuck's a doctor, he's a medical doctor, and he called me one day and told me that he had contracted cancer. It was testicular cancer, and that's a form with a real good prognosis, but he'd have to go through chemo and so he did, and it was vintage Chuck. You would have to know Chuck to appreciate this, but because he knew he was going to lose his hair, he actually shaved his head and covered it with glue and then put glitter on that and called himself Chemo Man. Which kind of freaked out people that came to him to be their doctor, and that's just totally Chuck. And he's a very slender guy, and going through chemo at a couple of points almost killed him. I mean, he was just wasting away to absolutely nothing, wanted to die at a couple of points, but he made it all the way through. We would talk to each other every Saturday, and chemo's done, everything's super hopeful. And then a month later, I'll never forget this, Chuck called me up, and he had just gone in for his first checkup post-chemo. And he said he had just gotten the results, and the cancer was back as strongly as it had been before he went through chemo. And he was a medical doctor, and he knew what that meant. He's a dead man. And I went to bed that night. We were living in Chino Hills. I remember this so vividly. I remember thinking to myself, I got to pray for Chuck. And then thinking, I can't pray. And then just having this thought, there had to be a mistake. Somehow there had to be a mistake. And I remember saying to Nancy, this is what denial looks like. I've always heard about denial. This is what it looks like. Because I just couldn't pray. He called me up, 6 o'clock the next morning. Somebody at the lab had switched his results with the results of another person who had not even gone through treatment yet. And that person ended up being okay. So they retested Chuck again, and he was clean. And they apologized because, again, Chuck's a medical doctor. It's a bad mistake to make. It's a really bad mistake to make when the patient is a doctor. And they said, you want us to fire the guy that switched the results? And Chuck said, fire him. I want to kiss him. And for that day, even for me, because this is my best friend, supremely for Chuck, when he got that word, it's like, I'm going to live. And I'm going to watch my kids grow up. And I'm going to see them all get married, and they're all married now, and get to see grandchildren, and the grandchildren have started coming. And it's like, I think part of what Dallas meant was, Paul says, redeem the time, for the days are evil. That, gosh, I remember when we were at Westmont one time, and Dallas was talking about that, and about how the life that's available before us is so infinitely brighter than the one that we end up living. And that Paul's language is exactly right. It needs to be redeemed, because Dallas said, your time is already in the pawn shop of lost souls. Your time is already in the pawn shop of lost souls. And that if it weren't for sin, when the Bible talks about be grateful in all things, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus, maybe the idea is every moment is this gift from God, such that if it were not for sin, if we were living in moral sanity, that overwhelming sense of gratitude that Chuck had when he found out he was going to live, is what we would experience every moment. For we have sinned, and our Father is younger than we. And I don't know, but I kind of think maybe that has something to do with what Dallas meant when he said, I regret the time that I've wasted. I regret every moment that could have been filled with this utter ease of the easy yoke, and the realization that I'm living in the reality of the Trinitarian fellowship, in the circle of sufficiency where everything is okay. And every moment of worry and self-preoccupation and ego and pride and anxiety over myself, ingratitude, was an unredeemed moment. And it's not that compared to the rest of us, it looked like Dallas was a slacker. It's how good life could be with Jesus. And that's what God wants for us. And nobody else will bring that to us. Paul says, redeem the time. Now, that's something for me to do. Redeem the time. And one day we'll stand before God, and God will ask, what did you do with what I gave you? Did you abound? And what did you do with your heart and with your soul? Did you abide? And He will not ask your boss or your supervisor. And He will not ask your spouse or your congregation. He'll ask you. He'll ask me. This is my one and only life in which I can abide in the presence of God and abound in His work. And we all need to learn to own that and help people in our churches learn to own that. And we live with this illusion that somebody's going to come along and just sprinkle us with some kind of magic dust that will make it all happen. Next observation. I will need certain systems in place if I'm going to abide and abound. I will need certain systems in place if I'm going to learn to abide and abound. One of the questions that Gary asked is, like, what do you do for your soul? And I'll mention a couple of things. For me, one is solitude. And Bill was saying he's more of an extrovert. I'm a bit on the introverted side, so I'm wired a little bit more that way. But I want to say a little bit about solitude, because I never really understood it again until I began to read, starting with the Spirit of the Discipline, the notion of spiritual disciplines. And Dallas would write about there's a way in which solitude is uniquely important for a particular reason. I want to try to unpack as best I can. Paul says that we are not to be conformed to this world. And Remember Dallas talking about one time, when you see that little phrase, the world in the Bible, the world is just the way most folks think. The world is just the way most folks think. And when we're in the world, when we're with other people, there is, or doing tasks at work or so, there is this constant, unrelenting pressure that's on us. And it's almost like the atmosphere. We're so used to us, it's on us all the time. Expectations and demands and perceptions and impressions and all that stuff. And it's molding us all the time. And it presses on our minds all the time. What's this person think? Is this person pleased with me? What does this person expect of me? And what happens in solitude, and the reason that solitude is a uniquely formative practice, is it's when I withdraw from the world. Okay, I withdraw from conversation, stimulation, other people, all that scaffolding, so that I can be alone with God. And that constant, unrelenting pressure that's just part of being with other people in relationships, that can go away. And in solitude, I find out what there is between me and God. When I first heard Dallas talk about solitude, I thought, well, I got to try this. And so my first thought was, I will take a day to spend in solitude as soon as I get a free day. Anybody want to guess how long I waited? Never happened. So I realized I actually have to we used calendars back in those days, get out a calendar and schedule a day to go off in solitude. And people sometimes wonder, what should I do in solitude? My wife is a raving extrovert. She says, solitude wouldn't be so bad if I could bring a few friends along with me. Again, there are disciplines of engagement where you do stuff you don't normally do, and disciplines of abstinence where you don't do stuff you usually do. Solitude is a discipline of abstinence. It's not about what you do. It's about what you don't do. In solitude, you refrain from conversations, from external stimulation, from noise, from relationship, from other people, so that you can be alone with God, and then you can find out certain things. In solitude, you will find out that you have a soul. In solitude, you'll find out what actually is running around in your mind. The first time I decided I would try to spend an entire day in solitude, it was very intimidating for me. I'd never done something like this before, and again, I'll just say one word about this when we talk about systems and practices. To remind you all and myself that these are a means to an end. They are not demonstrations of how spiritual we are. How many of you have ever read Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline? Okay, so a good chunk of us. That came out, I think, in 1979. I was going into seminary just after that. I read it. I did not like that book the first time I read it. And I will tell you why. I felt like I already feel guilty because I don't read the Bible and pray enough. And now somebody's telling me there are 10 other practices that I have to feel guilty about because I'm not doing them either. And I really didn't like it. And that's where, for me, it wasn't until almost 10 years later when I read The Spirit of the Disciplines and I realized, oh, no, it's about this life. And these practices are a means to an end. And so I have great freedom. If they help me grow towards that end, great. If they don't help me, then I'm free not to do them. But it's not that I have to master all of these disciplines. It has nothing to do with master. Has nothing to do with getting good at solitude. Okay, we are not called to get good at solitude. And, if you are able to obey God and live a life of love and joy and solitude doesn't help you to do it, then don't do solitude. But what happens in solitude is I'm getting away from the pressures, the expectations, the conversations, the stimulation, and I find out what is happening in my mind and my soul. And so for me, the first time I scheduled a day to do that, I went to a place called Wayfarers Chapel. It's in Southern California. It was a beautiful spot, and I brought my little journal with me, and I had a list of things to pray for, and I had a whole day blocked out, but by 10 in the morning, I was through praying my list. And I had no idea what to do. I had nothing left to say to God, and God wasn't saying anything to me. And so I just actually went down and crossed the road and sat on the beach. And I felt, it was so weird because I had this kind of glamorized, romanticized notion of what solitude would be like and what these great spiritual giants must have had, their conversations with God and their deep spiritual experiences in solitude. And I cannot tell you how much that was not the case. And I would have long chunks of time when I would just daydream about stuff. And then I would have anger fantasies. Does anybody here ever have an anger fantasy? And the way they work for me, because I'm Swedish, is I would think about somebody that hurt me, and in my anger fantasy, I wouldn't hurt them back. They would just see how deeply I was suffering in a noble way, and they would feel terrible. Those are my anger fantasies. And they're not even worth having. I don't recommend them. I'm just telling you what was going on. And I had always thought that those things were great barriers to pray. That prayer was about, okay, God, I'll intercede on behalf of my child or my church or so. And then I began to realize, you know what? That's the only mind that I have. That's my mind. And in solitude, I actually have the opportunity in an extended way to find out what is going on in my mind. See, most of the time, when we're just in the world, we don't think much about how our minds are working. It just feels to us like naturally we're thinking about whatever we're required to think about in these circumstances. That's why angry people don't feel like they're angry people. They just feel like, well, of course the world will elicit that response. See, but again, spiritual disciplines disrupt the normal patterns of thoughts and feelings that run inside our minds and bodies and make space for God. So in solitude, as long as you go off in it all by yourself, you don't have to be heroic. You don't have to accomplish anything. You can bring a Bible and read if you want. You can pray if you want. Solitude is not primarily about what you do. It's what you don't do. And it's something that requires a whole lot of kind of experimentation with it. And if you're anything like me, it will feel, especially at first, like an enormous waste of time. And it will feel a million miles away from whatever picture you have of what spiritually mature, advanced people do in solitude. But all that's happening is I'm just finding out this is the truth about me. And this is how much focused attention on God my mind is and is not capable of. And all that begins to emerge when I'm just alone. I just sat there on the beach and over time, one of the most meaningful moments came. I was watching seagulls and pelicans. Anybody love pelicans? I love pelicans. And there was something about watching them soar. And then this thought came. They do what I made them to do, and I want you to do what I made you to do. Now, was that thought from God? I can't prove that. I don't know. I'm real fallible. But it seems like the kind of thing that God would say. And it meant so much to me. But again, there's all these temptations with this. I can remember another time early on when I went with some friends on a spiritual retreat, and then there was an extended period of solitude, and then we were going to come back together. And I remember about 10 minutes before the solitude time was done, and we were to meet together and talk about that time, I remember very clearly having the thought, I have not yet had a profound thought or experience to tell my friends about. So I need to have a profound thought or experience so that when I get together with my friends to debrief solitude, I will have something impressive to tell them about. Well, that was my profound experience, that thought right there. That told me a whole lot about myself. So you kind of can't do solitude wrong if you understand it's just about what you're not doing. And then what will happen is you'll learn stuff. And another wonderful thing Dallas said about solitude or any other practice is that if it's helpful, it will be self-validating. It will be self-validating. That is, I will find that I like my life better when I do it than when I don't. And again, as in so many ways, the 12 steps are a wonderful example of this. Through them, people receive the power to live in sobriety, which they would not otherwise be able to do. And so those steps just become self-validating. You don't have to hype yourself up about them. You don't need to pep talk around them all the time. Our churches so often just become one more pep talk, and here's some stuff to do, because we think everybody's just kind of leaking, and so we got to psych them all up again. When practices are actually helpful, they are self-validating, because they're leading us into this kind of life. And so systems like Solitude are real important for me. Time, just being quite careful with my time. Doing what you need to do to protect your best time for your most important activities. And knowing kind of the rhythm of your life. My old boss, Bill Hybels, used to say, and I think this is profoundly true, what matters a ton in life isn't nearly so much time management as it is energy management. Because energy is so critical. Now again, we'll all understand when you think about the parts of the person, when we're talking about energy, we're talking about the body, we're also largely talking about the will. Largely because it's activities that demand willpower that drain us them so quickly. And so being aware of and shepherding the patterns of our use of energy, spirit. Spirit is non-physical, personal energy or power. And my son-in-law, who's really involved in the tech field, was telling me this staggered me. You know how much time the average worker spends today, the average knowledge worker, like somebody that's not doing manual work, spends on responding to emails? 50%. 50%. And just to step back and ask the question, like, is the amount of time that I'm spending on emails actually worth that time? So thinking through how my time is going. Making sure that there's a financial system in place for my life. Like one of the things that I do, in terms of both giving, generosity, I have a friend that knows all the details of my financial life. How much I make, how much I spend, how much I give. He sees it all. That's a real helpful thing for me, just in terms of financial life. I'll mention one other thing that's become helpful to me a ton in the last year. And Dallas used to talk, sometimes I always kind of like this phrase about, when you wake up in the morning, that's such a critical moment when you first wake up. Bonhoeffer in Life Together has this great section where he says the Christian should never begin the day burdened with anxiety because the beginning of the day belongs to the Lord of the day. And that first moment just sets that tone. And Dallas would say, when he would first wake up, he would always begin by either walking through in his mind the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm. And he said it was an act of mental hygiene. Kind of like you brush your teeth and, you shave or something in the morning. There's physical hygiene, but then there's mental hygiene. And there's a practice over this last year. It's gotten real important to me. I did it this morning. It was actually created by a guy named Martin Seligman, who again is not a believer, but it's become an important form of prayer for me, and it actually relates a ton to a little phrase somebody was mentioning, I think yesterday, set your mind on things above. Now, as a practical matter, how do you do that? And what does your mind look like when it's not set on things above? Well, for me, if my mind is not set on things above, the single most common dynamic that leads my mind away is worry. And it's quite amazing to me, although I don't think of myself as a worrier, it's quite amazing to me how quickly thoughts occur in my mind that just can drag me down in that way. So a guy named Martin Seligman, other folks that work in cognitive psychology have worked with this kind of thing, and it's real simple. A lot of you will know this, but there's a little model that's A, B, C, D, and E. And you take time to walk through each one of these steps with a troubling thought. So if you have a worrisome thought, what do you do with that? And A is the antecedent, and that is the circumstance that might trigger worry. For example, we have a vote coming up at our church, and it's around government stuff. I was telling you something about this, and I had gotten an email yesterday that was critical of me. Anybody here ever get criticized in your church? Only me. Well, anyway, I had gotten that, and then I find I can just brood over that. And again, that becomes habitual, so I don't even notice it. So A, the antecedent is I just write down, I got this critical email. And then B, I write down what are the beliefs that I have that cause this circumstance to be troubling to me. And I'll actually have to spend some time thinking about this, is naming what's actually going on in my mind. And there'll be things like, and again, they're often quite goofy beliefs. It's just what goes on in my mind. I'm a pastor. I'm giving my life to God. Nobody should criticize me. Everybody should just appreciate what I'm doing. Yeah, can I have an amen? Yeah, that's not actually rational. I didn't mean to promote that thought. It's actually an illusory belief. Another one is, if somebody really dislikes me, I think I dislike them back. You know, when it comes to forming friendships, the number one dynamic is proximity. The second most important dynamic is, do you think they like you? And if you think they like you, you're likely to like them back. And if you think they don't, you won't like them back. And then, you know, just all the beliefs that are connected with that. I can't be happy as long as there's somebody who dislikes me. And if this person dislikes me, probably lots of other people do. And then I'm probably a failure, and then probably everybody's going to kind of see that. I'm going to be on a downhill trajectory. And these beliefs, at least for me, are often quite irrational, but to actually practice the discipline of putting them on paper where I see them, so that I don't allow them to just churn on and on and on, is terribly important. Okay, so I actually name what the beliefs are. And it's kind of an interesting thing. When I put my finger on it, even if it's pretty irrational, just writing it down is enormously helpful, and it produces a little surge of energy inside me. It's like, yeah, I see that. And then, C is for consequences. And so then I'll write down, what are the consequences in my inner life of these beliefs? What are the consequences? I feel sad. I feel discouraged. I feel unwanted or rejected. I feel a loss of energy. I feel like giving up. Okay, so write down those consequences. And then D stands for dispute those beliefs. And so this simply involves beginning to think about this circumstance from a kingdom perspective. And very often I'll just start with super rock solid stuff like, God still loves me. And God will love me even if I mess up. And therefore, I want to be the kind of person that can receive criticism and not be deflated by it. And this person may be critical of this thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like me. And even if they don't like me, do I want to become the kind of person that's defeated and discouraged if somebody doesn't like them? No, I don't want that. This is kind of an odd thing, but I'll very often find on the dispute thing, something that happened to me in a real deep time is I was going through a really difficult time, and I pictured a movie in my mind. And I thought, now, if I was watching a movie and there was a character that was me, how would I want them to live? And I thought I would want them to be, open to pain in a painful situation and to be aware of it, but to be able to live with joy and openness and receive criticism where it was merited and have firmness of conviction. And I was on a track where I was getting discouraged and defeated, and I thought, I want to be that guy. I don't want to be that guy. And very often for me now, when I'm walking through the dispute thing, it'll be that I'll think about this situation and I think, okay, if this was a story in a book or a movie and somebody was going through what I'm going through, how would they behave if I were to admire them? And then on the dispute thing, I want to be that guy. I don't want to be that guy. And then E stands for energize. What are the ways that I am energized as I am disputing these faulty beliefs? And I'll find I feel more motivated, I feel more encouraged, I feel called to be my true self, I feel less likely to give up. And for almost the last year, I have been doing this very often, multiple times a day. And it really it's almost like what doing physical exercises do for your body. Like if you do push-ups or something, you'll feel the difference. It's like that. It's like it's producing new muscles in my mind. And I'll find myself thinking now, if I start to feel down about something, dragged down about something, I'll catch myself and say, I don't have to live in that. And I'll catch those thoughts that could other just spiral me and say, nope, there's actually an alternative. I can go through this little exercise. Now, for me, this has become a tremendously important act of what Dallas would call mental hygiene. And when you think about concretely, practically, how do you set your mind on things above? This is hugely helpful to me in setting my mind on things above. Because it's training my mind by the time I get to here to remember, no, those thoughts that defeat or discourage me, the without God thoughts, those are a mind set on things below. And again, Paul's language is so important. What is it? How do you set your mind? And so, again, this may not be helpful at all, but I just thought I'd let you know this one has been hugely helpful to me, is being helpful to me right now a ton around setting my mind on things above. And it might be helpful to you, might not, but if not, just figuring out how do you set your mind on things above. Because that's not just vague or abstract or ethereal. It requires a way. And so those are all part of kind of systems that I need in place to be able to abound and abide. Next observation. I must abandon the hope of pleasing everybody and grow comfortable with disappointing people when it is appropriate, if I'm going to abound and abide. Think about this. Who in his life did Jesus not disappoint? His family questioned him. Remember at one point they came to take him away because they thought he was out of his mind? Most of his disciples left him. The religious leaders crucified him. The crowds mocked him. The 12 deserted him. How often did Jesus say, I'm disappointing people, I must be the wrong guy for the job? Jesus was very comfortable disappointing people as long as he knew he was pleasing the Father. And you cannot please the Father without disappointing people. Now, it needs to be for appropriate reasons. You can't just say, well, my supervisor says she's disappointed in me. I must be getting really spiritually mature. Doesn't work that way. My goal isn't to disappoint people. My goal is to abound and abide, but sometimes that will involve disappointing people, and I have to be okay with that. Next observation, if I'm going to abound and abide, I will need to recognize the signs of destructive hurry in my soul. I will need to recognize the signs of destructive hurry. And Bill was referring to this statement of Dallas when I went to Chicago, and it was a really active place. That's when I called Dallas. A lot of you know about this many years ago, and kind of described life and asked Dallas, what do I need to do to have a healthy soul? And there was a long pause, and then he said that statement, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And then there was another long pause, and I said, okay, Dallas, I got that one. Now what other wisdom do you have? Because I don't have a lot of time, and I want to get as much wisdom as I can. And he said, no, there's nothing else. Hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. He said, hurry is real different than being busy. Busy is an outward condition of the body. Jesus was often busied. Hurried is an inner condition of the soul, where I am too preoccupied to be fully present with God or with other people. And in the kingdom, you can never do anything if you're hurried. And so we all have different capacities for busyness, for pace of life issues, but there'll be signs, ingratitude, a chronic sense that there's never enough time. These are signs of destructive hurry. Physical tension in your muscles. You might just check your body right now. Again, one of the things that was so attractive about Dallas was he just did not carry much hurry in his body. Somebody said about him one time, I would like to live in his time zone. And his time zone was unhurried daylight time. Inappropriate escapist behavior. Getting easily discouraged. Loss of compassion. So recognizing the signs of destructive hurry. Give you one more. I want to ruthlessly focus on abounding in my authentic giftedness and passion. I want to ruthlessly focus on abounding in my authentic giftedness and passion. There's a wonderful little story by Parker Palmer, who was a Quaker educator, teacher, thinker, very gifted guy. And because of the nature of what he did, he would sometimes have opportunities to do what would look like bigger and better things. And one time he was offered the presidency of a school. And I often think in life with folks, there'll be a lot of areas where people may not be gifted that doesn't bother you, but there'll be one area where you're not gifted, but you really want to be gifted. And having to come to grips with that one is one of the great crises of your life. And so for Parker, he was offered the presidency of this school. And in the Quaker tradition, when you have a choice to make, you pull together a few folks for what's called a Clearness Committee. And the task of that little group is not to give you advice, but it's just to ask questions so that you get to clearness on the Lord's will for your life. So Parker had been offered the presidency of the school, and so he figured he'd probably take it. He called together this little group of people as his Clearness Committee, and he said for about an hour they asked him questions that were really easy to answer. What would your vision for the school be, and all this kind of stuff. And then after an hour, somebody asked him, Parker, what would you like about being president? And he said, well, I wouldn't like having to wear a coat and tie every day, and I wouldn't like having to raise funds, and I wouldn't like giving up teaching. Somebody said, well, that's stuff you wouldn't like. What would you like about being president? He said, well, I wouldn't like all the politics involved, and I wouldn't like having to lead the faculty going through everything. And then they said, okay, Parker, you're just talking about what you wouldn't like. What would you like about being president? And he said, he got real quiet, and he said, well, I would like having my picture in the newspaper with the word president next to my name. And he said, somebody asked him in a real quiet voice, Parker, isn't there an easier way to get your picture in the newspaper? And what he came to realize there was that this task, although it looked quite impressive, was not what God was calling him to, and he wouldn't actually enjoy the craft. And so if I want to abide in God and actually abound in what God's going to call me to do, a lot of times it means kind of die into something where I have a need to do that, and yet that's not God's calling on my life, and it's an ego thing, and the sooner somebody's able to die to it, the more freedom there is on the other side. But that's often an enormous challenge for folks, and so getting to that other side is a good thing. All right, I'm going to pause here. We're just about done for the day, and I know folks are probably about at the end of the tether and getting ready to leave. But if there are a few questions around this one or anything else that we have talked about over the last couple days, we got a few minutes right now. So Trent is back on the microphone, and we'll bring up the lights and go for it.
What was the reference to ABCDE?
Sorry?
What was the reference? You said it was somebody's.
Oh, there's a psychologist named Martin Seligman. And actually, if you just Google Seligman ABCDE, you'll find out more about this. If you want a book, there's about a chapter, quite helpful in it, in a book of his called Learned Optimism. And he actually recommends doing it 5 times a day for 2 weeks to ingrain it. I found it took quite a lot longer than that before it really started to get ingrained in my mind. But eventually it really did. And again, it's just something where now I'm much quicker at being able to discern when my mind is starting to spiral in a non-productive way. And just actually going through this really does help me as I do that with God, set my mind on things above. And I've just found out I'm not nearly as much a victim of when things feel bad as I thought that I was. So, sorry? Sure. Yeah.
So I talked to you yesterday about mindfulness, and there's a popular book around the psychiatric setting I'm in that is "You Are Not Your Brain." So what does our faith say about, quote unquote, changing my mind through mindfulness versus what do we have to offer? Does that make sense? Because it's being touted now that you can change your own mind and you can break all these habits all by yourself.
Yep. So if I understand it right, a couple of thoughts. On the one hand, there'll be folks often in secular culture or often people in neuroscience who might say you're nothing other than your brain. And that actually reduces persons. It loses the concept of personhood. All the stuff that we were talking about, person, soul, and so, it loses all that, and we think of people then as just machines. And I think that's terribly destructive. That's a quite common thought. One of the ways that Dallas would talk about this, sometimes he did at our church one time, is, there's the brain, but then there's the mind. And the mind is quite a different thing. You can watch neurons firing, you can trace electrical impulses, but you cannot see an idea when you look at somebody's brain. You cannot see a thought. A mind is very different than a brain. And Dallas would say, God has never had a brain, and God has never missed not having a brain. And Dallas says that's why, for God, every decision is a no-brainer. I thought that was just like an absolute groaner, and I would never say something like that, but Dallas used to say it. So, understanding, again, this just gets to personhood, that we're not just machines, that physicalism does not tell the whole story, that synapses don't tell the whole story, and no neuroscientist has proven that. And if folks are able to map every synapse in the brain and correspond it to every thought, desire that people have, it still does not prove that there is no such thing as the mind. Okay? No one will ever see an idea the way that you see a neuron. So that piece is real important. Then, there are lots of different learnings about life that come from lots of different traditions. Mindfulness is one. And in a nutshell, there's a woman, I think it's Ellen Langer, who has written a ton about mindfulness. She's probably the best known person around that in our day. Lots of folks that talk about it come from the Buddhist tradition. And there's an enormous amount of what's helpful in that. And Augustine had that wonderful old saying, all truth is God's truth. And one of the terrible things that can happen when we reduce God or Jesus to a little box called Christianity, and we think of it as in competition with all these other religions, is then any statement that's made by anybody in any of the other boxes becomes a threat and a rival, and we have to find a way to dismiss it. And C.S. Lewis is wonderful about this. If you ever read through Mere Christianity, he says, when I was an atheist, I used to have to say that everything that any religion would say is wrong. When I became a Christian, I was able to become much more broad-minded and recognize that, for example, Christianity and Judaism and Islam have in common monotheism, and they all believe in a personal God. And so, of course, we agree on that with folks who would identify as Islam. And Dallas used to say, Hindus eat breakfast every day. I have no intention of giving up breakfast just because Hindus also eat breakfast. So part of the power of this notion of mindfulness has to do with the nature of the will and the mind. Remember we talked about that. That the mind, because it's embedded in the body, tends to be subject to deeply embedded habits, and the will is real bad at trying to overpower that. Okay, well, really, that's at the core of the notion of mindfulness. That if you try to override the mind through willpower alone, you set yourself up for defeat. I will be happy today. I will not think those thoughts anymore. And that's just simply truth about the human condition. And wise folks from all kinds of traditions have recognized that. And those of us that follow Jesus are welcome to embrace truth from whatever source it comes. And of course, we evaluate it in light of what Jesus taught. And we always believe that Jesus has the best possible information available on the human condition. But Jesus is the first person, Dallas said, Jesus is the first person who would say, if you find better information from any place else, take it. Of course, he's that kind of person. Jesus is the first person to say, you must ruthlessly follow truth wherever it leads. And so I think when it comes to something like reading about mindfulness, lots of it is written from folks who are part of a different tradition. We have great freedom to read it and see what's helpful in it, what's in accordance with actually what Jesus and Paul and great thinkers said about the nature of the mind and the will and the body. And we want to learn and grow in humility in every way from that. And oh my goodness, how the world is waiting for humble followers of Jesus who don't just dismiss folks from other traditions and caricature what they say in order to dismiss it. You know, it's really interesting. At Willow, Bill Hybels did this years ago. I thought it was really courageous. We did this at our church this last year. We had a weekend service where, for our church, we had a representative of Judaism, Hindu, Islam, secular atheism, and Christianity. And we had really good scholarly folks from each one of those positions, so they were just able to answer, some of the big questions. What surprised me was what a deeply spiritual experience that was for our church. And there was something about having everybody there where it's so tempting for those of us who are Christians who don't know a thimbleful about Buddhism, to read a couple of pages about it and then to pontificate to the people in our congregation, here's what Eastern thought teaches, but here's why Christianity is superior. Well, when you get everybody up on the platform together that are actually saying, here is what Buddhism teaches, and here's why Buddhism is such a complex tradition and has people that disagree with each other and has all kinds of nuances and complexities to it. It sounds a whole lot different than when you just get a Christian on a platform caricaturing it so that Christianity could win. And there was this amazing spiritual power in seeing those voices together. And I'll tell you, because we live in a global world, there's a hunger for that's huge. And, those of us that are Christians may get in trouble when we're standing in front of our congregation saying stuff like that, but I'll tell you, for thoughtful people, when they actually see real people with real faces from different traditions, it actually expands our souls. And part of what happened is, nobody came away from that, ironically enough, in our congregation saying, well, my trust in Jesus is threatened now. And people's idea of how big God must be actually expanded, and it became a wonderful spiritual experience. And I think we all need lots more of that kind of stuff. And we ought to be the first people to be humble and open and learn from truth wherever it comes from. And that doesn't make Jesus smaller, it makes him look bigger. Because, of course, part of the deal with Jesus is Christianity can't box him in. And part of what happens is we emphasize some stuff and we lose other stuff, and Christianity isn't 1,000th as big as Jesus is. So anyway, that's more than you asked, but that's my answer. So, yeah.
And it was a jaw-dropping experience. I was there that weekend at Willow, and it was a jaw-dropping experience. And you could even hear in Bill Heipel's voice how moving the whole experience was. It was, and it's something we should all be able to experience.
No, in that group, it was so wonderful. So we all met together, and I was surprised by, in our setting, just how much chemistry was there. And so we all went out for dinner afterwards. I mean, it sounds like a joke, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Jewish guy, an atheist. And we all went out for dinner, and we talked for a couple of hours, and it was just amazing. And we just talked about stuff like, for those of you who work in churches, you know how there's always a few just absolutely kooky people that are drawn to your church? So we posed the question, like, which religious tradition draws the kookiest people? And it was a fascinating conversation to have. And I think to have a conversation where I absolutely believe Jesus is it, and there's nothing relativistic or pluralistic about that. I think He's just it. And at the same time, I want to humbly talk about and listen to and learn from people of different traditions and learn what is it to love them. And not in that kind of mushy, all religions say the same thing, nobody really knows. Not that, but in a way that's humble and open and honest and looking for truth and saying God is so much bigger than any of that stuff. And yet there's something liberating and powerful in that. Remember Dallas saying one time, the test of Christianity in our day, the test is going to be how do we relate to other religions? And I think I understood that way better after that weekend than I did before. So, something over here.
On a completely different note, is this on? Okay. You talked about, and I teach, as you do that, people are precious individuals. You've never met an unimportant person and all that sort of thing. And find that people are so hungry to hear that. Then I'm inundated. How do you say, I don't have time for you, you precious, infinitely valuable person?
Yeah. For any of us who teach, there'll be issues of how do you deal with being accessible to people, and if you teach and there's a fair number of people there, lots of folks might want to come and have time with you. And of course, with Jesus, when you look at Him, He did not have time for everybody, and that was just simply a result of finitude. And so part of what that means for me or for anybody who's teaching is there's going to be people that get disappointed. And people who feel well, if you're really a loving person, you will have time for me. And if you say no to me, then I'm going to be mad at you. And I have to live with disappointing folks around that. And, so that will be part of what Jesus had to deal with and what everybody who does this kind of thing has to deal with. And, of course, I think about when I went through seminary, and there'd be folks that I would go and listen to, and they were important people, and so I would want to have time with them, partly because I felt like I can learn from them and admire them, and partly because they were important, and I felt like if I could be around them, I would be more important. So, dear Dallas, thank you for that book. Sincerely, John Ortberg, Ph.D. And so my own motives in wanting to be around folks were mixed, and I assume that's the case for everybody else. At the same time, part of what I have to recognize is there is deep lovelessness inside of me. And I remember when I met with Dallas years ago, and he said early on in his ministry, he had to train himself to love people. And our denomination went through this kind of painful deal over this last year of deciding to go into a new denomination, and that's involved lots of conversations. And so I've needed to pay more attention to just conversations about our church and following that sometimes online in different ways. And I remember reading an email. It was kind of painful because a woman said she had visited our church, and after the service, she stood in the back and watched as the speaker, and that was me, was greeting people. And she said the speaker didn't really attend to them. He was just looking past each person towards other people and wanted to get them through the line. And my immediate response was to just want to dismiss that. It's just my reflexive response. Well, who is she? She doesn't know me. She doesn't know my schedule. She doesn't care about me, so I don't like her. And then I had to kind of step back and say, well, is there really nothing in that criticism that's true that I need to learn about? Am I always really just as fully present as I'm able to be, even given the limitations of finitude? No, part of that is I need to feel that pain. I need to grow in that. And she was probably seeing stuff in me that I don't see in me and that I will excuse myself for too easily because I'm only one person and I'm finite. So I'd say that's another one of those tensions that at least I expect to always wrestle with. And part of it is it'll be a tension for the folks that I speak to. And partly it will be a tension for me, and it will point out that lack of love inside me. And I'll have to just keep learning and leaning into that and being okay with disappointing people and saying, God, help me to be a more loving person. I do know this, when I get to the end of my life, if I could move a little more towards being with people the way that Dallas was with people, I'd really like that. I'd really like that. Yeah.
You discussed yesterday a lot about Trinitarian community, and you mentioned that it's hard to lead without violating people. What's your experience of seeking to lead working teams like your elders or your staff into living, leading, and working in Trinitarian community?
Man. For me, part of why that's been such a huge challenge, that whole issue of leadership has been an enormous journey for me over the years. And when I was kind of first starting out, when I was finishing up with school, I had this huge ego emotional need to be a leader. And it took me a long, long time to kind of come to grips with the fact that I think whatever spiritual gifting I have is more around communication than it is with leadership. And then I got married to a woman whose primary gift is leadership. And she's a woman. And so, like, coming to grips with that, there was like many years where I could not have even seen that. And then eventually I was able to see it, but it was enormously painful. And then a huge source of ego death for me was to die to my need to be this leader. I can remember sitting in the basement of our house in Hoffman Estates and just wrenching sobs. All right, God, I will die to my need to be a leader. And that was in this one particular year that was just the darkest year of my life. And feeling like, I don't know what there is left, but I'll die to that, but I don't know now who I am. And a lot of that had to do with reputation, how people think of me, and then the irony of on the other side, there was so much freedom for me. And like to be able to just absolutely revel in love and celebrate Nancy's gifts. Where again, that is one of those areas where I know the change of going from I couldn't see them to I could see it and it was painful to I could see it and I love it and I celebrate it. And then to this place now where I'm at a church and as best I can discern it, God has put me there and is calling me to lead. And to use whatever gifts I have, including my limitations, because I have this place and this calling that I love deeply. And there is a wonderful freedom in saying, I'll lead the best I can. I'll be really diligent. One of the great things about having to lead or getting to lead is it forces you to grow in so many ways. Because you got to come to grips with your own motivation and you got to just be in constant learning mode and so on. But I'm super grateful to feel like I know I just have I got ego investment in other stuff, but I just have no ego investment in needing to be looked at as a great leader. And so I'm super grateful for that. But tons of stuff to learn because it can be real easy for me to abdicate. It can be easy for me to withdraw or disengage. And folks where that leadership gift is real strong or where they're real committed, they just plunge into it all the time. And I'll tell you one thing I've learned as we walk through this process in the denominational thing, and it involved lots of times where there was controversy and lots of outcomes that I couldn't control. Conversations going on, votes that would take place that I couldn't control. And I had to do a ton of this mental hygiene stuff as part of what really drove a lot of this last year. And it created a really odd dynamic. That's the best way I know how to describe it, where I have to fully surrender. I can't control the vote, can't control what people are going to say, can't control the outcome. I got to fully surrender, and I'll never surrender. I won't disengage, I won't withdraw, I will plunge in, I will problem solve, I will wade in neck deep, I will have difficult conversations, I will fully surrender, I will never surrender. And that kind of combination for leading within the Trinitarian fellowship, and to say, I'm not going to try to manipulate people, I'm not going to try to intimidate people, I'm not going to try to coerce people, but I'm also not going to withdraw or disengage is huge. I think most of us probably tend to err on one side or the other. And I think for people with real strong leadership, gifting, and octane, Dallas used to say the two forms of lovelessness are attack and withdrawal. Two forms of lovelessness are attack and withdrawal. And if you think of energy, attack is lovelessness with high energy. Withdrawal is lovelessness with low energy. Okay, people with real high leadership energy, they're likely to err by intimidating, trying to steamroll, trying to overpower, trying to manipulate. And people with lower leadership energy will tend to abdicate, withdraw, disengage, placate, appease. And so leadership in the Trinitarian fellowship is leadership that leads with love. And that means it doesn't do either one of those two things. It consistently engages, it consistently encourages, it lifts up, it confronts as needed. But for me, it just helps a lot to say, I don't want to be that guy, I don't want to be that guy. So someplace in between those two is what it looks like to lead with love. And then for people who are good at leading, and I hope there's lots of you here, and I hope we talk about this a lot, to build cultures of loving leadership, that's huge. And when you look at Ignatius or Wesley or Calvin or go all the way back to Jesus, you see these movements with incredible leadership that lead with love.